All she ever does is embarrass me." My father's voice cracked through the courtroom like a slap. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at him. I kept my hands folded, palms flat against my knees. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench, eyes fixed on my father. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Sir, you truly don't know, do you?" The room shifted. My father's lawyer froze mid-motion, papers half raised. Color drained from my father's face. "Wait," he said, blinking hard. "What do you mean? What don't I know?" I had imagined this room 1,000 times. Not because I wanted to win, not because I wanted him humiliated, but because I knew sooner or later the truth would have to stand on its own feet. The Portsmouth County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper, the kind of place where voices automatically lowered themselves as if the walls remembered every secret ever spoken inside. Wooden benches creaked softly as people shifted. Somewhere behind me, someone cleared their throat. I kept my eyes forward. 2 days earlier, I had been kneeling in my small front yard outside Norfolk, trimming back weeds that had grown wild along the fence line. My knee had started to ache the way it always did when the weather was about to change. Knox, my old German shepherd, lay nearby in the shade, his breathing slow and uneven, one ear twitching at every passing sound. That was when the envelope arrived. Cream-colored, thick paper, county seal in the corner. I recognized it instantly even before I opened it. Portsmouth Family Court. I wiped my hands on my jeans and slit the envelope open with my thumb. The words inside blurred for a second, then sharpened in a way that made my chest feel hollow. Petitioner Thomas Hale. Respondent Rebecca Hale. My father was suing me. Not for money, not exactly. It was about family reputation, about control of assets tied to my grandfather's name, about protecting the dignity of the Hale legacy. Words like abandonment and unfitness were underlined in neat legal type. I laughed once, a short, dry sound that startled Knox awake. "Well," I muttered, folding the papers, "that's one way to start a conversation." It had been 11 years since I'd left home. The last time I saw my father, he'd been standing in the driveway, arms crossed, jaw locked, telling me I was throwing my life away. "We don't do that kind of thing," he'd said. "Marching off airing family business in public. People will talk." I had been 22, already committed, my orders folded carefully in my pocket. I remember thinking even then that he wasn't worried about my safety. He was worried about how it would look. I carried the summons inside and set it on the kitchen table. Knox limped over and rested his heavy head against my thigh. I scratched behind his ears, feeling the familiar calm settle in. "I guess we're doing this," I told him. That night I didn't sleep much. I brewed coffee and sat at the table long after midnight staring at the paperwork. The language was cold, distant, like it was describing strangers instead of a father and daughter. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the darkness, relentless and loud. I thought about all the things I hadn't told him over the years, not because they were secrets, but because he never asked. I opened the old Navy chest in the corner of my bedroom. It still smelled faintly of metal and oil and salt water. Inside my uniform lay folded with care, medals wrapped in cloth, a flag folded tight into a perfect triangle. I hadn't worn the uniform in years, not since I came home for good. I ran my fingers over the fabric, then closed the lid. The next morning I called the clerk's office. "Yes, ma'am," she said politely. "Your father has filed a petition asserting that your continued absence and conduct have caused reputational harm, and that he should be granted authority over the Hale family property." "Conduct," I repeated quietly. "You'll need to appear in person if you wish to contest it." "I will," I said, and meant it. The drive to Portsmouth took less than an hour, but it felt longer. The air was thick with late summer humidity, the kind that clings to your skin. I passed the old diner where my father used to take us on Sundays. He'd sit in the booth, coffee steaming, telling anyone who would listen about his work, his values, his name. He never mentioned me. I parked outside the courthouse early. The brick building looked smaller than I remembered, its flag hanging limp in the still air. A janitor swept the steps, pausing when he saw me approach. "Morning," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the ribbon bar on my chest. "Morning," I replied, returning his nod. Inside the hallway buzzed with low conversation. Lawyers shuffled papers, families whispered. When I took a seat near the back, I felt eyes on me, not hostile, just curious. A woman in uniform always draws attention in places like this. When the clerk called our case, my father was already standing. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had gone gray, but his posture was still rigid, his suit pressed sharp. My mother sat beside him, pearls at her throat, hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look at me. "All rise," the bailiff called. The judge entered, an older man with a lined face and steady eyes. He glanced at me, paused, then took his seat. My father's lawyer began, his voice confident, rehearsed. He talked about embarrassment, about shame, about how my choices reflected poorly on a family that valued discretion and respectability. "All she ever does," my father interrupted, unable to help himself, "is embarrass me." That was when the judge leaned forward. And that was when everything changed. The judge raised a hand, not sharply, just enough to still the room. "Mr. Hale," he said, "measured and calm, you'll have your opportunity to speak. Please allow your counsel to proceed." My father exhaled through his nose and sat back, jaw tight. His lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, launching back into the argument as if nothing unusual had happened. They painted a picture of me that barely resembled a person. I was described as distant, unreliable, a daughter who had chosen spectacle over substance, service over family, a woman who had, in my father's words, forgotten where she came from. I listened without reacting. Years of training had taught me how to separate noise from meaning. Most of what he said was noise. As he spoke, my mind drifted back to the first time I realized my father cared more about perception than truth. I was 13. We were at a church fundraiser, the kind with folding tables and lukewarm coffee. I'd won a small academic award that year, nothing flashy, just a certificate and a handshake. When the announcer called my name, a few people clapped politely. Later, someone asked my father how his kids were doing. "Good," he said. "My son's starting varsity football this fall." That was it. No mention of me, no lie exactly, just omission. I learned early that silence could erase you just as effectively as words. When I told him years later that I'd enlisted, his face went rigid in that same familiar way. "You don't need to do this," he'd said. "People will think something's wrong if you leave like that." "People?" I asked. "Everyone," he snapped. "This town remembers things." I remember standing in the doorway that night, duffel bag at my feet, realizing he was less afraid of losing me than of losing control of the story he told about our family. The courtroom brought me back to the present with a scrape of a chair. My father stood again, unprompted. "She abandoned us," he said, pointing in my direction. "She left and never looked back. Missed holidays, missed funerals, and now she wants to stand here like she's better than us." "I never said that," I replied quietly. He turned toward me, eyes blazing. "You don't have to. You wear it." The judge's gaze shifted to me. "Ms. Hale," he said, "you may respond." I stood. My knee protested, a sharp reminder of why I no longer ran stairs for a living. I kept my voice even. "I didn't abandon my family," I said. "I served my country. And I stayed away because I was told repeatedly that my presence was an embarrassment." A murmur rippled through the gallery. My mother's hands clenched in her lap. "That's not true," my father said. "I never—" "You told me," I continued, not raising my voice, "that what I did made people talk. That I made you look bad. I took you at your word." The judge nodded slowly. "Proceed." I explained the basics. Where I'd lived, how I'd supported myself, how I'd remained connected to the family property through taxes and maintenance even when communication had stopped. My father's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge waved him off. "Let her finish." As I spoke, I noticed something subtle shifting. Not sympathy exactly, attention. People weren't looking at me like a spectacle anymore, they were listening. That unsettled my father more than anything else. "You think this is noble?" he snapped. "Showing up in uniform like that, making a scene." "I didn't come to make a scene," I said. "I came because you took me to court." He scoffed. "You didn't have to wear that." I met his eyes for the first time. "I didn't wear it for you." Silence settled, thick and uncomfortable. The judge scribbled something on his notepad. My father's lawyer shifted, glancing between his client and the bench, his earlier confidence draining away. As I sat back down, my thoughts wandered again unbidden. To nights overseas, sitting on the edge of a cot, writing letters I never sent. To holidays spent in places where the air smelled like dust and diesel instead of pine and turkey. To the quiet pride I'd learned to carry alone because sharing it only seemed to invite judgment. I thought of my grandfather, the only one who ever asked what I wanted instead of what I owed the family name. He'd been a quiet man, hands rough from work, voice steady. When he spoke, people listened not because he demanded it, but because he meant what he said. He used to tell me reputation fades, character doesn't. My father never liked that saying. The hearing paused briefly while the judge reviewed documents. The room buzzed softly with whispers. My mother finally looked at me, then really looked, her eyes searching my face as if trying to reconcile the person in front of her with the daughter she remembered. She didn't smile, she didn't frown, she just looked tired. When the judge spoke again, his tone had changed. "Mr. Hale, he said your petition relies heavily on claims of abandonment and reputational harm. Before we proceed further, I need to clarify something." My father straightened, sensing importance. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge folded his hands. "You've stated repeatedly that your daughter's actions have embarrassed you and the family." "That's correct." "And you're certain," the judge continued, "that you're fully aware of those actions?" My father hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "I know enough," he said. The judge leaned back, slightly studying him. "We'll see." My father's lawyer swallowed hard. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not relief, not triumph. Just the steady certainty that comes when you've done all you can do and the rest is no longer in your control. Whatever my father didn't know, whatever he had chosen not to see, it was about to step into the light. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that. The judge called a short recess. People stood stretched, whispered. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. I remained seated, hands folded, eyes on the grain of the wood in front of me. Knox would have nudged my knee if he were here, sensing the tension. Instead, there was only the quiet hum of the courthouse air system and the steady thump of my own pulse. I hadn't hired a lawyer. That decision had surprised everyone who heard it, including the clerk when I filed my response. She'd looked up from her screen, eyebrows raised. "Are you sure, ma'am? These cases can get personal." I know, I'd said, that's why. I wasn't arrogant enough to think I could out-argue a professional. But this wasn't about clever language. It was about facts, and about letting the truth speak without ornament. In the service, we learned early that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the strongest. Orders delivered calmly, clearly carried farther. The bailiff announced the court was back in session. Everyone took their seats. My father leaned toward his lawyer, whispering sharply. The lawyer nodded, though his eyes flicked toward the judge with a tightness I hadn't seen earlier. "Ms. Hale," the judge said, "you indicated you had documentation you wished to submit." "Yes, Your Honor." I stood again, moving carefully, and approached the bench with a slim folder tucked under my arm. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. I handed the documents to the clerk. She passed them up. The judge flipped through the pages slowly, methodically. Tax records, maintenance invoices, utility payments, dates stretching back more than a decade. These payments, the judge said, tapping one page, were made consistently. "Yes, sir." "And from an account under your name?" "Yes, sir." My father let out a sharp laugh. "That doesn't mean anything. Anyone can pay a bill. That doesn't make her present." The judge didn't look up. "Mr. Hale, you'll wait." I watched my father's hands. They were clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. I remembered those hands fixing engines, tightening bolts, teaching me how to hold a wrench. They had always been steady. Seeing them shake even slightly stirred something complicated in my chest. The judge finished reviewing the folder and set it aside. "Ms. Hale," he said, "you've remained involved with the property and its obligations despite living elsewhere. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it wasn't a simple one. "Because it mattered," I said finally, "to my grandfather, and because no one else was doing it." My father scoffed again, always the martyr. I turned to face him slowly. "You never asked." That landed harder than I expected. The room went quiet. Even the judge paused, his pen hovering above the page. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, you claim your daughter's absence caused reputational harm. Can you specify what harm precisely?" My father straightened, grateful for the opening. People talk. They ask why she never comes around, why she chose that life instead of staying with her family. It reflects poorly. On whom, the judge asked. My father frowned, on us, on the Hale name. The judge nodded slowly. I see. He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Ms. Hale, are you aware of any instance in which your conduct resulted in a formal complaint or documented harm to your family's standing in the community? No, sir. Have you ever spoken publicly about your family in a negative way? No, sir. Have you ever used your service to seek attention or advantage over them? No, sir. My father's lawyer shifted in his seat. Your Honor, with respect, the issue isn't documentation, it's perception. The judge's gaze snapped to him. Perception is not evidence. A few people in the gallery nodded almost imperceptibly. As the proceedings continued, I felt something loosen inside me. Not because things were going my way, but because I was finally saying what I'd carried quietly for years, out loud, on the record. I thought about the nights I'd spent overseas, hunched over maps and logistics schedules, moving people and supplies through chaos. No one ever saw that work, no parades, no headlines, just a quiet understanding that if you did your job right, nothing went wrong. That had become my approach to family too. Fix what needs fixing, pay what needs paying, don't demand thanks. The judge shuffled his papers, then looked directly at my father. Mr. Hale, he said before we proceed, I need to ask you something. My father lifted his chin. Yes? Are you familiar with your daughter's service record? My father waved a dismissive hand. I know she enlisted. That's enough. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Is it? My father's lawyer inhaled sharply as if about to speak, then stopped himself. I felt a subtle shift in the room, like pressure building before a storm. My stomach tightened, not with fear but with recognition. I knew that feeling. I'd felt it before missions, when all the planning was done and the only thing left was execution. Mr. Hale, the judge said, his voice quieter now. Are you aware of any official commendations your daughter has received? My father blinked. Commendations? Yes, the judge replied. Awards, citations, public acknowledgments. My father shook his head. She never told us anything like that. The judge looked at me briefly, then back at him. That, he said, is precisely the issue. My father's lawyer went very still. I sat down slowly, heart pounding, not from anticipation of victory, but from the weight of what was about to surface. I hadn't come here to expose anything. I hadn't planned a reveal. But I also hadn't hidden the truth. If my father had chosen not to know, that choice was no longer his alone. The judge closed the folder in front of him with a soft final sound. We'll address that shortly, he said. And in that moment I understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me years ago. You can't force someone to see you, but you can stop standing in the dark. The courtroom felt smaller after that. Or maybe it was just that everyone in it was leaning forward, now drawn toward whatever the judge was about to uncover. Even the old ceiling fan seemed louder, its slow rotation cutting through the silence. My father shifted in his chair. He tried to hide it, but I saw the telltale signs, the stiffening shoulders, the way his jaw worked, as if he were chewing on something bitter. Your Honor, his lawyer began. Carefully, my client's position has always been that... Counsel, the judge interrupted, raising a hand. I'll come back to you. He turned to me. Ms. Hale, earlier you stated you did not wear your uniform today to make a statement. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Why did you wear it? I took a breath. Not to steady myself, I was steady, but to choose the right words. Because it's the most honest thing I own, I said. It reminds me to stand straight when things are uncomfortable. The judge nodded once, as if that confirmed something he already knew. He reached to his right and pulled a thin file from a stack. Unlike the others, this one had a red tab on the corner. He opened it slowly, scanning the first page. Mr. Hale, he said, you've argued that your daughter's choices brought embarrassment to your family and this community. That's right, my father said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. And you've insisted, the judge continued, that her absence and silence demonstrate a lack of contribution or responsibility. Yes. The judge set the file down and looked directly at him. Then I need to ask you again very clearly, are you certain you know what your daughter has done? My father laughed a brittle sound. If she's done something so impressive, she never bothered to tell us. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gallery. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench, his voice dropping just enough to command attention. Mr. Hale, he said, Are you aware that your daughter was formally recognized by the Commonwealth of Virginia 3 years ago for her role in a civilian evacuation effort? My father frowned. What evacuation? His lawyer's head snapped up. The judge flipped the file open and slid a document across the bench, angling it so my father's lawyer could see. The color drained from the man's face as he read. I'll repeat, the judge said evenly. Are you aware that Ms. Hale served as the logistics lead for an emergency evacuation involving 47 civilians during Hurricane Elias, coordinating with state and federal agencies to bring them out safely? The room went utterly still. My father stared at the lawyer, then at the judge. That can't be right. The lawyer swallowed hard. Sir, he whispered, this is on the public record. I felt my chest tighten, not with pride but with the strange ache of being seen in a place I'd never expected. The judge continued, his tone factual, not theatrical. Ms. Hale's unit was activated on short notice. Roads were impassable. Communications were unstable. She coordinated transport routes, medical access, and shelter placement. No lives were lost. My father shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear water from his ears. She never said anything about that. The judge's eyes softened just a fraction. That doesn't negate the fact that it happened. He turned to the gallery. Several of those evacuated were residents of this county, including, he glanced back at the file, the brother-in-law of one of our court clerks. A quiet gasp came from somewhere behind me. My father's lawyer lowered himself into his chair as if his legs had suddenly given out. My father's face had gone pale. His mouth opened, then closed again. Wait, he said hoarsely. You're saying? I'm saying, the judge replied gently, that while you were concerned about appearances, your daughter was quietly preventing funerals. The words hit the room like a dropped weight. My father turned toward me, eyes wide, searching my face for denial, for explanation, for something to anchor him. You did that? He asked. I met his gaze, not challenging, not apologetic, just honest. It was my job, I said. The judge let the silence stretch. He knew its value. Mr. Hale, he said at last, can you explain to the court how this constitutes embarrassment? My father's lips trembled. I didn't know. That much is clear, the judge said. He looked down at his notes, then back up. The court does not find evidence that Ms. Hale's actions harmed the family's reputation. In fact, he paused, choosing his words carefully. The evidence suggests the opposite. My father's lawyer cleared his throat weakly. Your Honor, we'd like to request a brief... Denied, the judge said calmly. We're past that. He turned back to me. Ms. Hale, you've shown restraint throughout these proceedings. I imagine it hasn't been easy. No, sir, I said. But you remained respectful, he continued. You let the facts speak. He looked at my father one last time. Sir, sometimes what embarrasses us isn't what our children do. It's what we failed to notice. My father slumped back in his chair. For the first time since I'd entered the room, I saw something other than anger on his face. Confusion, and something that looked a lot like regret. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, not to announce a ruling yet, but to bring the moment to a close. We'll proceed to the court's determination, he said. I sat down, hands trembling just a little now, not from fear but from the release of something heavy I'd carried longer than I realized. The truth had stepped into the light, and there was no taking it back. The judge didn't rush the ruling. He sat there for a long moment, reading, rereading, as if weighing more than just documents. The courtroom held its breath. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. My father stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. The man who had once filled rooms with certainty now looked like he'd misplaced something essential and didn't know where to start looking for it. Before I issue a determination, the judge said finally, there are additional facts the court must place on the record. My father's lawyer lifted his head slightly, hope flickering for just a second, then fading as the judge continued. The evacuation Ms. Hale coordinated was not her only contribution relevant to this case. My father blinked. There's more. The judge nodded. Much more. He turned a page in the red-tabbed file. For the past 8 years, property taxes associated with the Hale family land have been paid on time, without exception. My father shifted. I know that. I've said we... Mr. Hale, the judge said gently, those payments were not made by you. Silence. They were made by Ms. Hale, he continued from her active duty account, and later from her disability pension after discharge. My father's mouth fell open. "That's not possible." "It is," the judge said, "and it's documented." The lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. My father waved him off, eyes still locked on the bench. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "she's been paying for that land all this time?" "Yes," the judge replied quietly. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to minimize, to deflect. But this wasn't the moment for that. The judge wasn't finished. In addition, he said Ms. Hale made recurring donations to the county's Veterans Relief Fund under an anonymous designation. Those donations covered emergency housing for several displaced families, including one connected to this court. He paused, then added, "The anonymity was broken only because the court was required to verify financial records during these proceedings." My father's lawyer stared at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves into a different story. My father turned toward me slowly, like he was afraid a sudden movement would shatter something. "You did all that he said. It wasn't a question." I met his eyes. I didn't think it mattered who did it. The judge folded his hands. "Mr. Hale, you've argued that your daughter brought shame to your family, yet the evidence shows she has preserved its assets, protected its legacy, and contributed to this community without recognition." He let that settle. "If embarrassment exists here," he said, "it does not originate from her actions." My father swallowed hard. His shoulders slumped just a fraction. I'd never seen that before. I didn't know, he repeated, quieter now. "No," the judge agreed, "you didn't." Something in the room softened then. Not relief, something more fragile. Recognition. I thought of all the times I'd stood in silence while my father spoke over me about me for me. How I'd learned to let that silence become armor. Now it felt less like armor and more like a bridge I'd never known how to cross. The judge looked at me again. "Ms. Hale, would you like to add anything before the court concludes?" I considered it. 1,000 sentences pressed at the back of my throat. Years of unsent letters, words sharpened by distance. But I shook my head. "No, sir." He nodded, approving. "Very well." He raised the gavel, then paused. "For the record," he said, "this court finds no basis for the claims of abandonment or reputational harm. Authority over the Hale family property remains with Ms. Hale, as stipulated in the existing documentation, and supported by her demonstrated stewardship." The gavel came down, a clean, decisive sound. My father flinched, not as if struck, but as if awakened. The room exhaled. People stood murmuring softly. A woman near the back caught my eye and nodded once, a small, respectful gesture. I nodded back. As I gathered my papers, my hands shook, not from triumph but from release. The kind that comes when something heavy finally lets go. In the hallway outside, sunlight poured through tall windows, dust motes floating like tiny stars. The air smelled faintly of rain. My father stood a few steps behind me. I felt him there before he spoke. "Rebecca." He hadn't said my name like that in years. I turned. He looked older up close, smaller somehow. His eyes were rimmed red, though his voice stayed rough and guarded. "You could have told me," he said. I considered that too, then answered honestly. "You could have asked." He nodded once, a sharp, embarrassed motion. "I didn't think you wanted us involved." "I didn't think you wanted me." The words weren't cruel, they were simply true. He looked away, jaw tightening, then said quietly, "I was wrong." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even complete. But it was real. He turned and walked toward the exit, shoulders hunched, lawyer trailing behind him. I stood there for a moment, letting the courthouse sounds wash over me. Footsteps, voices, life resuming. Outside, the sky had darkened, clouds rolling in from the coast. I breathed deeply, the air cool and damp. I hadn't come to win. I'd come to stop the lie. And for the first time, the truth stood on its own. I didn't leave the courthouse right away. I stood near one of the tall windows in the hallway, watching rain begin to streak the glass in thin, uneven lines. People passed by me in small clusters, lawyers murmuring into phones, families speaking in low voices, strangers returning to lives that hadn't just been split open in public. A man in a faded veteran's cap paused as he walked by. He looked at me then, at the ribbons on my chest. "Thank you for your service," he said, simple and sincere. I nodded. Thank you for yours. He smiled once and kept going. It still felt strange being seen like that. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Outside, the air smelled like wet pavement and salt drifting in from the harbor. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and walked down the courthouse steps, my knee protesting with each careful movement. The rain had softened the edges of the city, turning sounds dull and distant. I stood under the overhang for a moment, letting the day settle. I hadn't won anything tangible in that room. No money, no praise. Just the right to keep what had always been mine, and the truth placed gently but firmly on the record. That felt like enough. I drove without thinking, letting muscle memory take over. Before I realized where I was going, I'd parked near the old naval yard, the one I'd shipped out from the first time. The gates were quieter now. The paint faded, but the smell of water and steel was the same. I sat in the car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the rain drum softly against the roof. This was the part no one ever talked about. Not the courtroom. Not the recognition. The space afterward. The quiet that comes when the noise finally stops and you're left alone with what it cost. I thought about my father walking away, shoulders slumped, about the way his voice had cracked when he said my name, about how small I was wrong had sounded, and how heavy it still felt. When I finally drove home, Knox was waiting at the door tail, thumping weakly against the frame. He limped toward me, pressing his weight into my leg like he always did, grounding me in something solid and uncomplicated. "Hey, old man," I murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Miss me?" He huffed and leaned harder. I took off the uniform jacket and laid it carefully over the back of the chair. It felt different now. Not lighter, exactly, just quieter. That night I slept deeper than I had in weeks. The next morning, sunlight cut through the blinds in thin stripes across the kitchen floor. Knox padded in circles near his bowl, impatient. I brewed coffee and stood by the sink, staring out at the yard, at the fence I still needed to finish fixing. The phone rang around 9. "Ms. Hale," a woman's voice asked. "Yes." "This is the clerk from the courthouse. Judge Miller asked me to let you know the written decision has been finalized and filed. Everything remains as ruled yesterday." "Thank you," I said. "And thank him for his fairness." There was a pause. "My father served," she added softly. "He used to say the strongest people were the ones who didn't need an audience." I smiled. Sounds like a wise man. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a while, coffee cooling untouched in my hands. I wasn't sure what came next. For years, my life had been structured orders, timelines, objectives. Now there was just space. Around noon, I drove into town for supplies: paint, nails, replacement boards. On my way out of the hardware store, I saw my father's truck parked crookedly near the curb. He was leaning against it, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. I considered turning around. Avoiding him would have been easy, familiar. Instead, I walked over. "Didn't expect to see you here," I said. He glanced up, startled, then nodded. "Your mother needed light bulbs." Silence settled between us, not hostile, just awkward. "You didn't have to wear the uniform," he said finally. I met his gaze. "I know." He shifted his weight. "People talked." "I'm sure they did." He frowned, then sighed. "That's not what I meant." The words hung there unfinished. "I didn't know," he said again, quieter than before, "about any of it." I nodded. "I know." He looked at me, then really looked like he was trying to memorize something he'd missed. "You always were stubborn." I almost smiled. I learned from the best. That earned a short, humorless huff. "Well," he said, pushing off the truck, "I should go." "Yeah." He hesitated, then added, "Your mother. She wanted me to tell you dinner's Sunday. 6 o'clock. I searched his face for expectation, for demand. Found neither. "I'll think about it," I said. He nodded, satisfied with that, and climbed into the truck. That afternoon I drove out to the old family property. The farmhouse looked tired but steady the way it always had. I walked the perimeter, checking boards, measuring what needed repair. Under the porch rail, faint and worn, were the initials my grandfather had carved decades ago. I traced them with my thumb. For the first time, the place didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a responsibility I was ready to carry without resentment. As evening settled, I sat on the porch steps with Knox beside me, watching fireflies blink in and out of the tall grass. The air was cool, the quiet earned. I hadn't fixed everything. But I'd stopped pretending there was nothing to fix. And that felt like a beginning. Sunday arrived quietly. No dramatic skies, no storm warnings, just a low, steady overcast that softened the edges of the road as I drove toward my parents' house. Knox rode in the passenger seat, head resting against the window breath, fogging the glass in slow, even puffs. His presence made the silence easier to carry. I hadn't worn my dress uniform this time. Just the khaki service uniform, clean-pressed familiar. Not a statement, just who I was. The driveway looked the same as it always had. Gravel crunching under tires. The old barn leaning slightly to the left. Tools hanging in neat rows inside, lined up with military precision. My father's kind of order. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, hands on the steering wheel, breathing in and out until my shoulders dropped. When I knocked, my mother answered almost immediately. "You came?" she said, not hiding her surprise. "I said I'd think about it," I replied gently. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house smelled like roast chicken and thyme, a scent that pulled memories out of places I hadn't visited in years. The table was set the way it always had been, mashed potatoes on the left, gravy in the blue bowl with the chipped edge. My father was in the backyard when I found him sitting on the porch steps, oiling an old rifle that hadn't been fired in decades. He didn't look up at first. "You're on time," he said. "You taught me that," I answered. He nodded once, accepting the truth of it. We sat there for a while, the three of us eventually listening to the wind move through the trees. No one rushed to fill the silence. That felt new. At dinner, the conversation stayed small at first. Weather, the drive, Knox's limp, my knee. Things that could be named without reopening wounds. Then my father cleared his throat. "I watched the news clip," he said, staring into his glass. "The one the judge mentioned." I didn't say anything. "They talked about leadership," he continued. "About planning. About staying calm when everything goes wrong." He looked up at me. "You always were good at that." It wasn't praise exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. "I didn't understand it," he said. "What you were doing, why you didn't call, why you didn't come back." I didn't know how I replied. Every time I tried, it felt like I was defending myself just to exist. My mother reached across the table, placing her hand over his. He didn't pull away. "I thought," he said slowly, "that if you stayed quiet, maybe you were ashamed." I shook my head. I was protecting my peace. Something shifted then. Not healed, but aligned. After dinner, my father stood and disappeared into the house. When he came back, he held something small and worn in his palm. My grandfather's compass. "I kept this," he said. "Thought I'd earned it." He held it out to me. "But it's yours." I took it carefully, the weight familiar even after all these years. The needle inside still swung steady and sure. "Honor," my grandfather used to say, "is knowing which direction you're facing even when no one's watching." "Thank you," I said. My father nodded, eyes glistening just slightly. "You didn't embarrass me," he said quietly. "I embarrassed myself. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public. It was enough." When I left that night, the porch light stayed on behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing side by side at the door. No waves, no words. But they were there. Back at the farmhouse, I placed the compass on the nightstand beside the folded uniform. Moonlight caught the metal, throwing a soft glow across the room. Knox circled twice before settling at my feet with a satisfied sigh. For the first time in a long time, I slept without dreaming of courtrooms or orders or unfinished conversations. Weeks passed. I repaired the porch, rehung the swing, painted the shutters. Each task grounded me, turning forgiveness into something tangible measured in nails and brushstrokes instead of apologies. One evening, my father drove up the dirt road without calling first. He walked the property slowly, hands in his pockets, nodding at the repairs. "You did good," he said. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. As he turned to leave, he paused. "If you're speaking at the high school next month," he added, "your mother and we might come." I smiled. I'd like that. Later, standing alone on the porch, I looked out over the field as dusk settled in. Fireflies blinked on and off like quiet signals. The world felt steady. I thought back to the courtroom, to the moment my father shouted that all I ever did was embarrass him, to the judge's calm question, "You really don't know, do you?" Maybe that was the real turning point, not the ruling, not the recognition, but the moment ignorance lost its shield. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove ourselves to people who aren't ready to see us. We raise our voices. We collect evidence. We wait for validation that may never come. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is live so honestly that the truth eventually introduces itself. If this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a child, a relationship still waiting for the right words, take a moment. Sit with it. Share your thoughts below. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what this stirred in you. We have many more stories like this to share, quiet journeys of dignity, resilience, and second chances. Subscribe if you'd like to keep walking that path with us. Thank you for listening.